I want to do a brief critique of Buddhism like we did with Hinduism. So before I give my critique, what are some of the things that are appealing from what little I've shared with you, and what would be some of the things that might concern you about this Buddhist tradition? I think I mentioned in my last lecture I never met a Buddhist I didn't like, which is something. And even though I'm sure they're out there, I just haven't come across them yet. I've been very pleased with the Buddhists I've met. Like Christianity, it's very egalitarian, or at least in theory, right? Open to men and women. It's not based on race. It's not based on caste. Everyone has the chance to get off this wheel of illusion in this lifetime if you want to. You don't have to keep dying and being reborn. And that is the great goal of Buddhism, is to get off this wheel of samsara. But here's my first critique, and I mentioned this earlier. If you desire to get off the wheel of illusion, or if you even desire to stop desiring, that itself is a desire, and it's going to make you unhappy, because and you will eventually desire again, you're going to be disappointed, and that disappointment is going to cause sorrow. And it could be something as simple as, if on your deathbed you've lived this desireless life, but you desire just one more breath, you'll get your desire. But it won't just be one more breath, you will be reincarnated back into another lifetime of breaths that you have to deal with all the pain and suffering that comes with it. So desire has to be extinguished. Now, I do believe there's truth to what Siddhartha Gautama said, in that desire is the cause of suffering, but desire can also be the cause of love and joy and affection, right? We often desire that which we do not have. Now, for the Buddhists, they would have to say they have everything, because they are one with everything. And so to have a desire would to show that you are not one, you are lacking. I find this an interesting contrast with Christianity in particular, in that whereas Buddhism tries to diminish or free us from desire and the accompanying suffering, Christianity steeps us in desire, right? In fact, hope and faith are bounded in desire, because what is more despondent than a hope that does not come to pass? What greater suffering than if we expect the Lord to return and he doesn't? I mean, how devastated and miserable our life and condition would be. And so not only does the Christian ideal or theology elevate desire, but it also sanctifies suffering. It doesn't ask us to remove ourselves from it or to deny suffering, but to actually embrace it, to share the sufferings of others. This is the way of the cross. And I find that's a really interesting contrast. Now, both Buddhists and Christians can be very empathetic. I think when they're practicing their teachings correctly and getting to the heart of the matter. But in Buddhism, like I mentioned, you have to annihilate yourself. I was talking to a Buddhist in the chat room, and I was trying not to use Christian language, but I was explaining to him, how do you annihilate the self? Who is it that's annihilating you? And I said, if it's you that annihilates the self, there's still a you that is existing or who has accomplished something. And I said, in the Christian tradition, it's taught that we have to be crucified or put to death by another. And in Romans 6:6, it's talked about, know you not that you have been crucified with Christ. See, when you try to crucify yourself, after The Passion and the Christ, that Mel Gibson movie, some guy went home and built a cross in his garage, and he nailed one of his hands in and both his feet in, but he still had one hand waving free. And it's like what I would call almost crucified. And in a Buddhist concept, I would call it almost annihilated. And that's the problem. We can't crucify ourselves. We can't put ourselves to death. It has to be done to us by another. And I don't know, I shared that with this Buddhist, and it was an interesting conversation. Because, see, this is the problem. And Christians have the same problem. If you use the flesh to put to death the flesh, it's still the flesh that gets the power and the glory and the praise, right? And the flesh is still in control. If it's the self that puts to death the self in Buddhism, there's still a you that did the putting to death. And that becomes a problem. Like, how do you completely disassociate from a point of view or from an ego perspective into this universal mind? And so philosophically, those are two of my biggest problems. Some of my more petty problems would be perhaps how maybe the problems of denying the physical material world and how that could affect our bodies, our physical health, mental health, those sorts of things. Overall, I generally like Buddhists. I think there's a lot of really compatible teachings and practices with Christianity, but I would really see this concept of the self and this idea of even God. In fact, many Buddhists have been accused of nihilism or atheism. And you could see why that would be so, because in the end, for the Buddhist, it just doesn't matter. It just is. You know, there is no good or bad, happiness or sorrow, highs or lows. It simply is. And if you get caught up on those emotional roller coasters of joy, well, you're going to have to hit the downtime of sorrow. And so Buddhism's offering you that even keel. And like I said, if you're a 21st century American, an even keel is probably not really appealing, right? Living this kind of like neutral life. No peaks of joy, no depths of despair. But if you were from 6th century India, probably most of your life was below even the neutral, right? And so coming up to neutral would have been a huge gift. For people that are doing well, that have good health, wealth, they can satiate and gratify the flesh and their ego, Buddhism probably isn't going to sound real appealing. But for those who hedonism is not the answer, they realize the dust and ashes that come by trying to please yourself through the senses, they might be in a place where they want to move beyond the senses, beyond the illusion, into this universal mind of self. And I can see why Buddhism would have a great appeal for those people. Questions? Comments? Okay.